This morning what I'd like to do is invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to Luke chapter 2. If you've been here with us throughout the Advent season, we've been studying what are called the Songs of Christmas. We've spent most of our time on Mary's song, but today I want to have us consider together a song called the Angel's Song. It's found in Luke chapter 2. It's found in verse 14 of that chapter. I think it'd be appropriate. Chapter 2 of the book of Luke contains Luke's account of the Christmas story. I think it'd be appropriate for us to read beginning at verse 1. So we're going to read from verse 1 through verse 20, but concentrate especially on verse 14, the Angel's Song. If you don't have your own Bibles, I invite you to take out a Bible in the chairs around you. You can find the passage we're looking at on page 725. These are the very words of God. And I begin reading in verse 1 of that chapter. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over the flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men on whom his favor rests." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. And when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. Now, today I want to draw your attention especially to verse 14, which has traditionally been called the Angel's Song. Verse 13 introduces it this way: "Suddenly, a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying," and now this is the angel's song, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to men on whom his favor rests." This song, I think, is so profound and significant. And in order to really dive into it here, what I'd like to do is just set the context. I think as Luke tells the story, he really paints a picture of great contrast. There are two individuals here at the center of the story that are so distinct and opposite from each other in so many ways. And it's after he paints the picture of these two very different individuals that this song really comes into play and makes the most sense. And so this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to just begin with Luke's presentation of this Christmas story, if you will, kind of hearing it fresh again with you today. The first individual that just stands out, and these two individuals are juxtaposed against each other, I think, for a reason. The first individual that stands out is this man who we read about in verse 1, Caesar Augustus. Verse 1 says this: "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree." Now, I want to talk about some things that maybe you'll remember from your high school world history class, or maybe you've watched a special on the History Channel. But I want to talk about this man, Caesar Augustus. His name wasn't always Augustus, if you remember from what you learned back in high school. His name originally, the name given to him when he was born, was the name Octavian. And after Julius Caesar died, there was this positioning for who would become the next emperor in Rome. And there were two main contenders, Octavian and Mark Antony. And some of you will remember how Cleopatra got all involved in that. But finally, Octavian was the one who prevailed. And when he took hold of the throne in Rome, he gave himself a new name, the name Caesar Augustus. Now, I don't know how many of you will know this, but what does Augustus, this name, this title, mean, Augustus? It literally means exalted one. And for a moment, I want to just think a little bit about the psychology. What gets into the mindset of a man who at some point, I mean, imagine, okay, whether it's Billy or Peter or Alice, at some point turns to their friends and says, by the way, I don't want you to call me Scott anymore. From now on, you can call me the exalted one. You're like, what? What is the mentality? What gets into a person's mindset where they turn to everyone and say, you will now call me the exalted one? I want you to just be thinking about that. Just a little bit more about this man. You can already begin to think about the psychology of a person who would call himself the exalted one. I want to show you a picture. This picture is of a coin. After Julius Caesar became the emperor in Rome, in the Roman Empire, he had coins minted so that every person, if they were buying and selling, they would be using a coin just like this. So these coins were popular in Jesus' day, and in order to transact business, you would use these type of coins. You can see the coin here. The picture on the face of the coin is of Caesar Augustus. In fact, you can see his name on the right-hand side. You see that? A-U-G-U-S-T-U-S. Can you make that out? So this is a picture of Caesar Augustus. And I want to draw your attention to the 5 letters on the left-hand side of the coin. If you can make them out, they are D-I-V-I, and then the letter F, which stands for the Latin words Divi Filius, which I don't know how many of you took Latin in high school. I didn't. But literally means, in Latin, the Son of God. Now, I think Luke starts the Christmas story with this man for a very particular reason. And these coins, they were just common. Every day, Jesus and the disciples probably held these coins in their hand. Think about the psychology of a man who would have given himself the name or title Augustus, the exalted one, and who would have had coins printed with his image on it. On the right-hand side, reminding everyone that he is the exalted one. On the left-hand side, telling everyone that he was the Son of God. Just think about the psychology of that man. It's interesting how the story begins. It says, in those days, Caesar, the exalted one, issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And verse 3 says, and everyone went to his own town to register. I want you to think about the kind of power and authority this man believed himself to have. That while sitting on a throne in the city of Rome, he could simply issue a decree. I now issue a decree. And in the most farthest, far-flung reaches of his empire, everyone would get up from the place where they were and go to their hometown in order that they might register for a census in order to be counted by him. Think about just a person sitting on the throne, issuing a decree, and in the farthest places away, people must get up and move to another place. And I will submit to you, if you begin to think of the picture of the psychology of this man, here was a man who was prideful, self-absorbed. He was full of self-aggrandizement. He thought of himself as being at the center of the universe. If he didn't think of himself as being like God, he might have actually thought of himself as God on earth. And that's how the story of Christmas began. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree. Now, just out of interest here, why do you think Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken? For what purpose? Somebody's taxes. I want you to think about this just for a second. Rome had conquered all these foreign lands. There was this huge empire they are now ruling over. And now Caesar Augustus, because he's ruling over these places with his thumb down on them, wants to perform a census so that he can count how many people he has in his empire so that he can receive wealth and riches from them in the form of taxes. By the way, Caesar Augustus issued into history, you'll probably remember this from your high school world history class, a period of time known as the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. What had happened, actually, this Peace of Rome was probably characterized like this: an absence of conflict. This empire had become so huge, his army so large, that there was simply no other nation or army that could oppose it. And so for a long period in history, there were no substantial wars because there was no one who could face this empire. And I want you to just think about the portrait of this man, Caesar Augustus, sitting on his throne, issuing decrees like this, that a census should be taken, how he had his thumb down on the most farthest places in the universe, what he thought of himself in his own heart, kind of pride that swelled within as he thought of himself as really a man like God on earth. Luke, I think, deliberately places him at the beginning of the Christmas story and juxtaposes that picture with a very striking contrast. The contrast of this young, poor couple who at some point gives birth to a baby, which they wrap in cloths and place in an animal feeding trough because there's no room in the inn. Now, throughout this time, as we've talked especially about Mary, I've talked about how she is this young, poor girl that history would have otherwise never known. And I just maybe want to fill out that picture here a little bit. If you were to read through the Gospel of Luke, Luke points out again and again that both Mary and Joseph were from this small, podunk, out-of-the-way town in Galilee called Nazareth. Now, we're so used to hearing Jesus of Nazareth that probably doesn't strike us. The way it ought to strike us is something like this. No matter, I think, probably where any of us grew up, there was probably some town kind of out in the sticks where the hicks and the sticks were from. Kind of the rednecks, that's what. In my own case, I grew up in this town of Battleground, Washington, just down the way, kind of out. There was a small town called Amboy. And all those kids came to our school, and they were the hicks from the sticks. They were the rednecks. Maybe for us today, it's something like what Okeechobee is to Port St. Lucie. Or what Port St. Lucie is to West Palm Beach. You know, those of us who are from the Pizzle. We've got our own issues here too. I mean, these were people who were from an out-of-the-way place. They were nobodies from nowhere. And I want you to think about this picture of this tiny baby wrapped in cloths lying in a feeding trough.